Okay, 2-minute rule. Welcome, everyone. I'm sure it comes as no surprise why I decided to do this mini class tonight in light of the context of what occurred last week at the Supreme Court in one of many still to come challenges to Roe v. Wade, and the implications that it will have for us as Americans for reproductive choice. But we're not going to talk politics tonight. We might talk about where the different faith communities are when it comes to these decisions and the differentiation between Judaism and Christianity. But we are not going to talk about how to reach out and guarantee that there are rights. That's part of the social action committee agenda that I hope would be present. I was looking at a resolution on the right to legal and accessible abortion in the United States that was put out by the Rabbinical Assembly, and then also in a similar way by United Synagogue just a number of years ago. And it begins by saying a ban on abortion or a direct violation of constitutional rights confirmed by Roe v. Wade. Every resolution that we've put out by every rights organization has that as its first premise. And for many, it is quite painful that that premise may be removed. So we're going to study some text tonight. And Mark, you can, if you would, put up the texts. And thank you to Mark and Amy and Mark for running the text tonight. You can try to make it a little bigger on the screen maybe, so for people that are going to be reading. Okay. It seems like whenever I set up an either or question about Jewish tradition and Jewish text, we often have the same answer. So is Judaism pro-life or pro-choice? And the answer is yes. Yes, Judaism is pro-life and Judaism is pro-choice. So we will go through various texts, some of which would reinforce those who were strongly pro-choice, and some of which might surprise you and would reinforce on a limited extent the pro-life. I should say from the outset that the whole gamut of mainstream Jewish organizations today, from Reform to Reconstructing to conservative and modern Orthodox, all believe in essence in an answer yes. They believe they are pro-choice and in a woman's right to choose, but they come about it in different ways, and that's what we're going to see. So, who wants to read the first paragraph?
Rabbi Simcha Bunim taught, every person should have 2 coat pockets to use as the occasion demands. In one pocket, a slip of paper with the words, I am little lower than the angels. In the other, a slip of paper with the words, I am but dust and ashes. Take out the first and you know your infinite worth. Embrace the powers of thought and action God has granted you as a human being, the jewel of creation. Remove the other and remember your finitude, and your mortality.
Okay, so I call this a dose of humility when we have this kind of discussion. I am a little lower than the angels. We are all gifted, we believe, made in God's image and gifted with a soul. And on the other hand, remembering our mortality as dust and ashes And the fact that humans, Jews, for thousands of years have had to make very difficult decisions, life and death decisions for people with tremendous consequences based on different values. And like those who have participated over the last few years in Beyond Dispute or the recent Israeli-Palestinian class, they're all about the fact that we hold values to be important to us, but sometimes the importance to us in our lives of individual values rises above the others. So I'm going to do the first one here where it says the first mitzvah. So we know that the first mitzvah in the Torah is Peru Urvu, be fruitful and multiply. And part of that, you see in Hebrew, I wrote Isser Hotzaat Shichvat Zara, which means that it's not just be fruitful and multiply, but that even, right, anything that prevents being fruitful and multiply, hence the story of in the early part of Genesis of spilling the seed and the idea that you're not allowed to spill your seed because it's for procreation, right? And anyone that fails this mitzvah of Pru'urvu is guilty of bloodshed because it was a potential life, not an actual life, but a potential life. Someone read for me this passage, which comes right after Noach, the story of Noach. Simple sentence.
I'll read.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, Susan.
Oh, all right.
Susan.
He who spills human blood shall have his own blood spilled by man. For God made man in his image. Shvach. Oh boy.
No, I'm sorry. I don't expect you.
Adam ba'adam. Okay.
Okay.
It was that first one that tied me up.
In the context of the Torah, and we're not going to talk about its context, but clearly, right, this is a prohibition against murder, right? He who spills human blood shall have his own blood spilled by man. And the reason is God made us, each of us, in God's image, right? So there's that godly nature. And in Hebrew, it says, Shvach dam ha'adam ba'adam. There is, and I didn't include it, there is a section in the Talmud Sanhedrin, which is actually all about punishments and death penalties and those kinds of things in the court. And the passage in Sanhedrin says, in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, it was said, a Noahide, that is someone that isn't Jewish but follows the 7 Noahide commandments, a Noahide may be put to death even for the killing of a fetus. Interesting. The Talmud says a Noahide may be put to death for the killing of a fetus. What is Rabbi Yishmael's source? And he quotes this from Genesis 9:6. One who spills the blood of a person shall have his own blood spilled by another person. But if you read it carefully, it really is saying one who spills the blood of a person, it could be read, I should say, one who spills the blood of a person, ba'adam, that's inside another person. Then the Talmud goes on to say, which person is inside another person? It refers to a fetus in the mother's womb. Now, I do have to say here that there's a lot of commentary on this text. And one of the responses says that this is really hard to accept. Think about it, that the embryo as a person, right, for them, as a nefesh, for them, the sons of Noah is not a person for us. In other words, if most of you have studied a lot of the texts or have seen a lot of the texts we're going to review tonight, and it's clear that it's a potential life, but it's not always treated as a full life, especially when a choice needs to be made. But in the time of the Talmud, we're going to study some of those texts that clearly show that. So how could they say that an embryo, a nefesh, for them, it requires punishment, but not for us? And then the commentary goes to say it isn't for them either. The Torah was just more severe in the practical ruling for the Noahides, but therapeutic abortion would be permissible to them too. And the fact is, the seminal work that was written 40 years ago by David Feldman on the Jewish sources of abortion highlighted the fact, and we're going back 40, 45 plus years, that, as he writes, almost all agree that abortion for sufficient cause is permissible. The issue is the sufficiency of the cause. What's the sufficiency of the cause? And then the question is, do you build down or do you build up? Anybody know what that David Feldman, in considering this issue about abortion, what do you mean? Do you build down or do you build up? Anybody? No? So he never used these words, but let's go back to the title, right, of pro-choice or pro-life. There are people who are pro-choice, and that's their basic foundational status. And then from pro-choice, they have limits to what that pro-choice would mean. And the same with pro-life. There are people who are pro-life, but still believe that you can have limitations that would permit abortion. So let's go to the classic Torah text. It's really the first time that we get anything that would seem to mean a pregnant woman, a fetus in the terminology that we use generally before a baby is born. And this is the classic source from the Torah. Volunteer to read.
I'll read.
Okay.
Exodus 21, 22 to 25. When men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, below Yehiyah Ason, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage, Ason, ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise.
Okay, so what is this text telling us?
It's not as bad to cause a miscarriage as it is to do that, as well as harm the woman in some way, maybe kill her.
Okay, anyone want to hone down on that a little bit? You're right, Edie. You are correct. The latter part of it says that if damage ensues, right, that is not a miscarriage, but the damage, the penalty shall be life for life, right? Capital crime status, essentially. If the woman is killed in the fight, but in the case that no other damage besides the miscarriage, and you notice that the words are highlighted here, damage, below ason, as long as there's no other damage besides the miscarriage, then it's a payment. If other damage, ason, ensues, the penalty is life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, etc. Okay, so let's go to the next reading. Now, the reason I chose this reading is because it's the same quote from the Torah, except for the eye for eye, tooth for tooth section, but it's from the Septuagint. The Septuagint was the Greek translation of the Torah, dated to approximately 3rd century BCE. And it's important to know that the early Christians, by and large, in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries, et cetera, as Christianity was being formed, and certainly following Constantine in the early 333 CE of the early 3rd part of the 4th century, they were reading the Septuagint. They were reading it in Greek. They were not reading it originally from the Hebrew. And the Septuagint says, and I'm going to take that one, and if 2 men strive and smite a woman with child, and her child be born imperfectly formed, he shall be forced to pay a penalty. As the woman's husband may lay upon him, he shall pay with a valuation. But if perfectly formed, he shall give life for life. So any idea how that changes it at all? It needs some elucidation, but.
First quick question is, why does it begin with 2 men and then go to just one person, he?
Oh, because he is the person who did the attacking.
So if two men are just striving,
2 men are fighting.
one actually smites.
The woman is an innocent bystander that happens to be standing there.
Oh, so striving is they're having a fight.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. They're having a
it.
fight, and the woman is there. And in the first example, the woman miscarries, but there's no capital punishment for it, which seemed to imply, right, that it has a lesser life status as maybe a potential life that we'll see, but not equal to someone already living, right, out of the womb. So that's monetary damages. But if that man strikes the woman and she dies, right, or other things, then it's life for life, hand for hand, foot for foot. Okay. Here it says her child shall be born imperfectly formed. Right? Now they use that as a miscarriage results, right? But imperfectly formed. So, and the other would be perfectly formed. So the Septuagint in Greek translates ason, that Hebrew word ason, right? Which means the damage in a sense, as form, right? If there is a form, right, an image, then you give life for life. Sort of invokes that notion of B'Tselem Elohim, that we were all created in God's image. And probably the reason for the translation is due to the similarity between the Hebrew ason and in Greek, soma. Hear that connection there? Ason and soma, right? The damage, ason, but soma meaning human life. And therefore, I'll get to Sandra in a second, and therefore, what the translator of the Septuagint, or the groups that did it, if they believed that word meant human life, it became a much more theologically evocative word for them to pay attention to. Yes, Sandra.
Okay, if the dog won't bark, I'll ask my question. So my confusion is, isn't the translation of the word smite to kill, or is it just to hit? I mean, from that type of Old English into, in other words, if the woman, it sounds like the woman was killed. So why wouldn't capital punishment be on the table anyway? I'm going to mute because of the dog.
No, it isn't though. In the first part of the traditional biblical text, the woman it's damaged. She miscarries. She doesn't die, but but there's no other ason, there's no other damage, which means they're creating miscarrying with financial remuneration, with damage.
Right,
And
but it's, oh, I'm sorry, go on.
go ahead.
Now, my question is, in the Septuagint, when it says if two men strive and smite a woman with child, does that not mean they've killed, that this one of them has killed the woman? Or
No,
does that just mean they hit
no,
her?
no, smite, no, thank you.
That
That's
was
what
my
you meant.
question. That
Yeah,
was-
I mean, remember that this is an English translation of the Septuagint, so that's a hard thing to answer. But I know we're used to that biblical exodus that will be coming too soon. I will smite you down. But the word smite is also used as punishment. It doesn't always mean killing or death in any way. But it's clear that the early Christians that read the Septuagint were listening on a different level in some senses because of the theologically evocative word. So for them, it's the idea of that the woman miscarried but was imperfectly formed. And then it was just monetary. But if it was perfectly formed, meaning it depended on where that woman was in her pregnancy, then it would consider to be life for life. And you'll see in a moment, that's in essence, in some ways, that's how the original thinking in Christianity was, as it was in Judaism. So the next text from Sanhedrin 91b is a text that deals with something that we don't, well, at least we don't necessarily hear it discussed in the news or in the context. We hear it's a life, it's a potential life, it's a viable life. But this is a text on ensoulment. On ensoulment, right? When do we get our soul, that soul that makes us a little less than angels, from that very first text? So who would like to read?
I'll read.
All right, Doris.
Antonius Caesar asked Rabbi Judah first, the patriarch, when is the soul placed in a man? At the time of the heavenly decree commanding conception, or at the time of the embryo's creation? Rabbi, at the time of its creation, Antonius, can a piece of unsalted meat remain 3 days without becoming putrid? It must therefore be the time of conception is decreed. Later, Rabbi used to say, Antonius taught me this matter, and scripture supports him, for it says, my spirit preserves me at the time of your decree.
Okay. So what is this? What is this Talmudic text telling us?
It seems that the conception is when the soul happens.
Well, no, that's when right. Well, that has Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi sort of agreeing, which would be all the way back to the initial. It's hard to know what they meant, right? The initial act of sexual act that where the sperm comes into the egg versus what they might have considered a little bit later on with the embryo's creation. All right. But this concept of ensoulment caused a divergence in Judaism and Christianity. Aristotle believed that the rational soul was infused 40 days after conception for a male, and interestingly enough, 80 days for a female. That's a whole nother. But 40 days is when the soul was infused. And that became, in some senses, the Jewish view of ensoulment. And believe it or not, it was at one point the Catholic view as well. That would surprise you, given what you hear as an absolute in the Catholic Church. It was Plato that believed that ensoulment was at conception. And eventually, the Catholic Church did follow that Platonic tradition, forbidding all abortions, but not right away. Right? For example, the Code of Justinian in the 6th century exempted from penalty abortion in the first 40 days. That meant that they created that difference in the very first 40 days, and we're gonna come to what the rabbis called that in a moment. But they were exempted, and that Justinian code, right, the 6th century, was upheld for 1,000 years until 1588, when Pope Sixtus V declared all abortions to be murder. Now, if you would tell most Catholics that, they would say, absolutely not. It's been a bedrock of the Catholic Church ever since its very beginning, right? But actually, in 1588, 3 years later, Pope Gregory rescinded that, and that decree that essentially that all abortions are murder from the very, very, very beginning, right? No abortion at all, like the strictest of what's proposed by so many states that will go into effect if Roe v. Wade is overturned. That didn't come back permanently until 1869 with Pope Pius IX. Now, why does ensoulment really matter? Why did this matter to the church? Why would it matter for Judaism? Any ideas? Why would it even matter when ensoulment took place?
Well, it introduces an idea that is not knowable by anybody on earth, that it's hidden behind mystery. And that could work for the organized religion, behind this idea. It's, just shrouds it in mystery. So you just sort of accept it.
Okay. But there's also that context. Yes. So anything that's shrouded in mystery, but they would coach it in religious terms, right? Of the divine. It's that divine part of us, of our soul. And if that's divine and divinity, that gives us life and meaning, and therefore we can't do anything. I think it's interesting to note, what's the first thing we start with in services on Shabbat morning? What's the first thing we do for those that are online or in shul?
Modani.
Elohai,
No, we at Beth Israel.
Elohai Neshama.
Right, we sing Elohai, Elohai, Neshama, right? So we say, Neshama shenatata bi tehorahi. The soul, God, that you gave me is pure, tahor. It's an interesting use of terms. I've studied this before over many years ago in that song alone, in that piece of liturgy alone. But what's the implication of saying, the soul you have given me is pure?
Well, it's the opposite of the Christian belief that we're born in sin.
Absolutely.
So they feel that when a baby's born, in order to be saved or whatever, it has to be baptized.
Exactly.
And if the baby's life is ended before it's born, that's like a lost soul.
Correct. So for us, we believe that the soul is immortal regardless of when it enters or leaves the body, as against Christianity, right? You have to have baptism, or you have eternal damnation, or you have to get sacrament of the sick before you die in order for you to rise to heaven, right? The soul of a fetus could enter the next world from the time of ensoulment, but for us, it isn't a theological critical issue of future life in the way that it is for Christianity. Okay, let's go to the next one.
Rabbi,
Most of you,
maybe you're
Yes.
going to get to this, but isn't there a midrash that at the moment a baby is born, an angel sort of punches you in the upper lip, and that's why you have the impression in your lip, and that's when you actually get your soul?
Well, that's actually when you had the knowledge of all the universe. Dara Horn wrote a whole book about that, as you may remember, a number of years ago. So yes, there are all kinds of midrashim of what happens to ensoulment and midrash, but we don't talk about it very much because for us, there isn't that same consequence that there is in Christianity. But yes, but a midrash is a midrash. There are lots of midrashim that explain why we have the indentation and God's touch, etc. Okay, let's go on. Nope. Right. Okay, someone read. Another Mishnah.
I'll read.
Okay.
David. If a woman has life-threatening difficulty in childbirth, one dismembers the embryo in her, limb by limb, because her life takes precedence over its life. Once its greater part, some version head, has emerged, it may not be touched, for we do not set aside one life for another.
Okay, so that is one Mishnah that is very graphic and very disturbing. I would bet that most of you have studied that at one point or another, right? But there is such a differentiation between a fetus, and in this case, you'd have to use, a potential life versus an existing life, right? That you can take it apart limb by limb. Very, very graphic, very disturbing, as is the description of what late-term abortion looks like when it has to be done, right? So in Judaism, there's a phrase for that, sar gufa kadin, which means that the woman's welfare is the key to warrant abortion. Her life, the woman's warfare. All right, David, why don't you read the next one too from Maimonides, which is interesting. This is typed wrong, but it's Hilchot Ritzicha, the laws of murder.
Right. I was just going to say, what you just mentioned, the woman's life takes precedence, and that becomes, of course, a big discussion about when is her life threatened. Is it
correct? We'll get to that.
Okay.
We'll get to that.
In Christianity, isn't the baby, don't they save the baby if there's a choice?
Yes.
Yes.
There's no distinction between the life of a mother and a child at that point. It's,
Right.
whoever-
So they wouldn't
whoever makes
harm. They would. It's not that they preference, but they would never think of even doing anything like that because the baby's given equal weight, and therefore you can't harm the baby in order to save the mother.
As a former Christian, I never heard of that before. I think we have to distinguish between Christians and Catholics.
Well, yes, that's true, but most Christians believe this also. They may
Okay.
not believe. They may not believe about the ensoulment part of it. You're right. That's a more Catholic belief.
Okay.
But the idea that it's considered murder, right? And that a baby is a life is, every evangelical church.
That's even, I used to be an Episcopalian, and maybe that's a more liberal
Okay,
branch,
so
but-
I'll break that down a little bit, and hopefully we'll get to it.
okay.
So read this next part.
Sure. Do not take pity on the life. Do not take pity on the life of the rodef. On this basis, our sages rule that when complications arise and a pregnant woman cannot give birth, it is permissible to abort the fetus in her womb, whether with a knife or with drugs, for the fetus is considered a rodef of its mother. You're gonna have to roll up a little bit.
No, that's
Roll
it.
up. That's it.
Oh,
Okay.
that's the end of that text.
I
So
think rodef is
so-
thief, isn't it?
no, rodef in Hebrew
Or
means
somebody coming to kill
pursuer.
you. Yeah, I'm
For
sorry.
someone coming pursuing you to
Right, to
kill
kill
you.
you, right?
And some of you may remember that term was used in with a very sad ending around the time of the discussion of creating peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And Yitzhak Rabin was vilified using texts in Judaism that claim that he was a rodef, that he was trying to kill the soul of the Jewish people and attack the Jewish people that would die, and therefore it was okay to kill him. And when Yigal Amir shot and killed Yitzhak Rabin, he used this term, rodef, a pursuer. Someone's after you to kill you, then you have the right to be able to kill them, right? And therefore they're saying, right, it's permissible because they're saying that the fetus is like a rodef, out to kill the life of the mother. So, by the Middle Ages, there were really two positions in Judaism, right? Rashi already accepts the principle that the fetus is not a person. It's a potential life, but it's not a person, and there you can permit abortion. And Rambam would have said that abortion is justified, even though the fetus has a high value, but only because the fetus is characterized as an active endangerment to the mother. And basically in that case alone. Okay. Next one. I want to go to just that last right there. What I highlighted, because it's no reason to read all this. This is from Yevamot, and they're discussing a woman is nida. When is she, when does she become ritually impure and everything else? And the answer is, if she has the baby before 40 days, she is not considered ritually impure. Why? And this is where you get this phrase, mayim be'alma. Mayim ba'alma, that the fetus is mere water in 40 days, and therefore it's not considered to be formed enough to make that. Now, having just gone through the process of a daughter-in-law that was pregnant and having children, we talk now a lot about viability, and we talk about science, right? And science always informs our discussion in the Jewish community, right? We know today that an embryo in the first 40 days is not just mayim be'alma, right? It's not viable in any way, right? But we know that by the fourth week of pregnancy, the embryo is barely 1/25 of an inch long, but yet its brain, its spinal cord, its heart has begun to form arm and leg buds. Within 2 weeks, the heart starts to beat, blood to flow, brain activity commences. By the end of 8 weeks, all essential organs, external body structures, eyelids, etc. Right? So why do I mention that? Because sometimes you're going to have a context under which some of the Jewish sources were created, that when we're confronted with science, we can't really say it's mayim be'alma, right? And a broader question, which we're not going to address today, but which we do whenever we write a responsa to a difficult issue is, should scientific knowledge, in this case about development and viability of a fetus, change how we view some of those texts? And even the language that we choose, we call a fetus, or do we call a baby? When it's your baby, it's kind of hard to call what's inside of you a fetus, even though those terms are used very specifically and are used sometimes for political or theological reasons. So I want to just look at the next one here.
Can I ask a question, Rabbi, before you go on? So
Yes.
do you really think that the rabbis believe this literally, or do you think they were using this term figuratively? I mean, they experienced women having miscarriages at 30 days, and they knew there was more than just water there. So I would think this was more.
Well, they knew that there was water, and they would have seen something that was 1/4 of an inch long, but they wouldn't have had the ability to study it and to know the way.
Of course not. But I'm just questioning whether they use the term to indicate that, in fact, the fetus before 40 days has no quote unquote value. that
has no standing whatsoever. In
Yes,
some senses,
exactly.
I think what they were trying to do is say, after 40 days, you would give it a higher level of consideration as
Right.
potential life.
Yeah, that's
That would be a better way to put it. But
Yeah.
clearly, they didn't have the knowledge that we have now.
Of course
Right?
not. Of course not.
Science, a fetus is well, okay, let's get to the next one.
Yeah.
It's interesting because here it says in the Babylonian, in Chulin, it calls the fetus the thigh of its mother, ubar yerech imo. And that they sometimes saw too. It would be attached to the thigh. The Talmud actually goes on to talk about that an embryo, and this was sort of a legal, just tort question, an embryo that's found in a purchased animal, does that embryo belong to the previous owner? Or is it part of buying it? Is it a part of the animal and comes with it as part of it, or is it sold separately? And in Jewish law, it's intrinsic to the body of the animal, belongs to the buyer. The same way why in Roman law, and then later on in our own law adapted in the United States for slavery, the slave and an unborn fetus together, right, is considered one. And I'll contemporize this in the fact that when a woman who is pregnant converts, right, that child, in a sense, does not have any judicial personality of its own, right? You can say that, ultimately they'll have a choice, but that child is Jewish. That fetus inside the woman is Jewish. Okay, so let's go to modern poskim. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was the posek, the decider of law for the Orthodox world in the 50s, 60s, 70s, with a fairly strict approach, right? And someone want to read? Volunteer?
I'll read.
Okay.
Rabbi Moses finds that Moshe Feinstein adopted a particularly strict approach. In his view, abortion would only be permitted if the doctors determined that there was a high probability that the mother would die were the pregnancy to be continued. Where the mother's life is not endangered, but the abortion is required for reasons of her health, or where the fetus suffers from Tay-Sachs disease or Down syndrome. Scroll it up there again. Abortion is prohibited, the prohibition being equal in severity to the prohibition of homicide. This is the case even if bringing the child into the world would cause intense suffering and distress to both the newborn and his parents. According to Rabbi Feinstein, the prohibition on abortion also applies where the pregnancy was a result of a forbidden sexual relations, which would result in the birth of a mamzer.
Okay. So basically, Moshe Feinstein was a pretty serious pro-life stance in observing the texts, and also as someone that studied medicine and science that was known at the time. And his only thing was the death of the mother, that's the only way in which potential life and life, there should be a differentiation, but not Tay-Sachs or not forbidden sexual relations. And being a mamzer has its own severe punishments that come with it. Okay, the Tzitz Eliezer Waldenberg in Jerusalem, he wrote. It's not that he was liberal; he was a respected posek, a decider of Jewish law. But he actually wrote a lot about issues that the community was facing during the Holocaust and difficult b'sha'at dechak, the term that we've used during the pandemic, of things that we allow. So who would like to read that?
All right, I'll read. Excerpts
Okay.
from Seats Eliezer, Waldenberg, Jerusalem, 1915 to 2006. If there is a danger to the mother from continuing the pregnancy, one should permit abortion without hesitation. Also, if her health is poor and to cure her or relieve her from great pain, it is necessary to abort the fetus. Even if she is not in actual danger, there is room to permit it, based on the halachic authorities' evaluation of the situation. In the case of a baby who will have Tay-Sachs, one should permit abortion as soon as it becomes evident without doubt from the test that indeed such a baby will be born, if indeed we may permit an abortion according to halachic, because of a great need and because of pain and suffering. It seemed that this is a classic case for such permission. And it is irrelevant in what way the pain and suffering is expressed, whether it is physical or psychological. Indeed, psychological suffering is in many ways much greater than the suffering of the flesh.
Okay, so what does he introduce that we haven't heard about yet?
Psychological.
Right. Psychological, emotional trauma. That's an element that we haven't heard about yet. And just so you think that that's a more modern thing, I included in there in the next one from Rabbi Mordechai Winkler, Levushe Mordechai, from 1913. So over 100 years ago. It's pretty surprising that a very traditional rabbi 100 years ago would write, mental health risk has been defined equated with physical health. This woman in danger of losing her mental health unless the pregnancy is interrupted would therefore accordingly qualify for abortion. Interesting. That goes back a little bit, that idea of if there are that there are other reasons as well. Okay, so I want to go ahead.
I remember in late 60s, early 70s, in order to get an abortion, a woman had to be seen by a psychiatrist to get clearance for this abortion. It happened to a friend of mine.
Right, if they could even get it. Well, if you're talking about after Roe v. Wade, then yes. And we're gonna come to a discussion of something that might surprise you if you haven't seen it before. So I just want to end this one text with a section from the Zohar, because the Zohar is spiritual, so we can't take it as an aspect of halacha, of Jewish law. But I think it brings us back to almost that very first text that we started with, that sense of humility, of the soul that God gives us is divine. And then when we're talking about these kinds of issues, we do so very carefully. So someone would like to read?
I will.
Go ahead.
There are three persons who drive away the Shekinah from the world, making it impossible for the Holy One, blessed be He, to fix His abode in the universe and causing prayer to be unanswered. The third is He who causes the fetus to be destroyed in the womb, for He destroys the artifice of the Holy One and His workmanship. For these abominations, the Spirit of holiness weeps.
Oh, very poetic. If those people who are clearly on the side of pro-life would quote from the Zohar, it would surprise a lot of Jews. That God weeps even with the loss of potential life, right? Because we are a life-affirming religion, even with potential life. We have our laws and our traditions, v'chai bahem, right, to affirm life, the value of life, almost above all other commandments. So I thought you'd like to know, and what I found here was pre-Trump, because I'm just using that as a timeline. It was about five and a half years ago. that the Public Religion Research Institute did about the opinions of American Jews on political economic issues. What percentage of Jews in America would you think, Jews in America of all denominations, what percent of Jews in America support legalized abortion in some fashion?
50–60%, maybe
Okay,
more.
50, 60. Anyone else?
90.
93% when this was studied, right? 50%, right, in all cases, across the board, no matter what, no restrictions, and about 43% with some differences. Okay, that's a pretty surprising. Actually, we are the only group. Jews are. You can take it off for now because you're going to put up the other one. We're the only group that was surveyed in which a plurality support abortion in all cases. The only religious group in the country, right? No other faith group does that support reach more than 25% support of all others, all right? The closest, right, would be white mainline Protestants at 59%. But Black Protestants are 50, Catholics are 48, right? Clearly, our take on this is different because of what we've read in Jewish tradition, right? That personhood, in a sense, begins at birth and not at conception, that the life of the mother supersedes that of the fetus. And you know, there are limitations even amongst those people that were surveyed, you know, abortion for purposes of gender selection or convenience or economic reasonings, et cetera, et cetera. So what I want to do is share with you, Mark, put up the other one, Israel's solution. So the reason I want to share Israel's solution is simple, and that is because Israel as a country has to take into account both Jewish tradition, halakha, Jewish values that are maintained and held by a large percentage of their population, and yet it is a modern country that has to deal, in a sense, with women's rights and all of those things of the essentially in the 20th and 21st century. So someone want to read? I'm going to let you read through. I'm not gonna stop all the way through. So someone up to doing some quick reading.
Israel's abortion policy is an all too rare example of a compromise that gives both sides something important in a case where Jewish and liberal values clearly conflict.
I just want to mention that current policy that you're reading was adopted in 1977. So it was just a few years after Roe v. Wade.
Whereas the letter of the law declares abortion legal only in exceptional cases, its application in practice makes abortions available to virtually anyone who wants one. But that tension between theory and practice is precisely what makes the policy one both sides can live with. By law, abortions require the approval of a committee comprised of 2 doctors and a social worker. These committees, which all hospitals have, can approve abortions only in the first 24 weeks of pregnancy. After that, a special exceptions committee must authorize that procedure. And at any stage, approval is possible only if one of the following criteria applies. The woman is under 18 or over 40. The pregnancy stems from rape, incest, or an extramarital affair. The baby is liable to physically or mentally. The baby is liable to be physically or mentally impaired, or the pregnancy endangers the woman's physical or mental health.
Okay, so now stop. First of all, I just want to highlight that in the same week last week, where the discussion was coming before the Supreme Court, Israel's health minister, Horowitz, proposed a new plan that would eliminate the need for this panel for up to 3 months. So in your first trimester, you wouldn't even have to go before any kind of panel, even though that panel overwhelmingly approves almost every abortion, as we'll see. So here you have Israel, where we see a compromise, right, between theory and practice. In theory, that potential life is very important. It has meaning. Jewish tradition points to it. In practice, they created a way, and what are those restrictions? Under 18 or over 40. So you can't do it just because I'm not ready to have another child. I have one and I'm not ready to have two, or two ready to have three, even though most of them are granted anyway. But under 18, over 40, rape, incest, physically or mentally impaired, Tay-Sachs, etc., a woman's physical or mental health. Okay.
How about extramarital affair? I find that
Meaning she got
interesting.
pregnant from somebody else. She gets pregnant from somebody else. Another person's the father. Right.
I was
Okay.
surprised by that too. That struck
Yeah.
me as that jumped off the page.
Right.
Well, probably because of the stigma, the mental and stigma of being a mamzer in Israeli society. The chief rabbinate, a mamzer can only marry another mamzer. And I don't think they have a J-swipe in Israel for mamzerim, people born from adulterous relationships where they're married. So there are tremendous consequences to that in Israel with the rabbinate. Okay, let's go on. But in practice, continue. You can continue, David.
But in practice, 98% of all abortion requests are approved. These criteria, especially the ones about the woman's mental health, are flexible enough that some committee can always be found to say yes. Moreover, he noted, since abortions that meet the criteria can be approved anytime, they end up being easier to obtain here than in many liberal European countries, where limits on later day abortions are much stricter.
Right. We hear some of this argument in the political realm, where those that are more conservative in their approach say, even what the state of Mississippi is promoting as a potential compromise, they want it overturned, not as a compromise, but is less strict than some of the more liberal democracies in Europe that don't have complete free access. Go on.
The result is that while neither the liberal nor the Jewish side gets everything it wants, both get something important. Liberals get the fact that almost everyone who wants an abortion can get one, even in cases where Jewish law wouldn't permit it. But they don't get a legal right to an abortion, nor is the fetus deemed merely part of a woman's body, subject to her full control. Religious Jews get a law which sends a clear message that destroying a potential life is justified only in exceptional circumstances. But in practice, they must accept many abortions that don't meet that standard. Oh. I have a new job. And for most Israelis, the compromise clearly works. That's why abortion is such a non-issue in Israel. It works for those who want abortions because they can get them. And it works for those who oppose abortions because its message about the value of life seems to be effective. At 117 abortions per 1,000 live births, Israel's abortion rate in the past year was lower than in any European country except Croatia. It's interesting. And its fertility rate, even excluding the Haredim, is the highest in the developed world. It's the only Western country with a birth rate above replacement rate. The compromise is possible because Jewish law doesn't believe life begins at conception and therefore doesn't consider abortion murder. It's hard to compromise over murder. But in Jewish law, a fetus is only a potential life, one that shouldn't be destroyed without cause, but lacks the status of an actual life. Thus, Jewish law actually mandates abortion if the mother's life is endangered. An existing life takes precedence over a potential one. And some rabbis permit abortion if pregnancy endangers the mother's mental or emotional health. Yeah, that's
Okay. Any reactions?
Yeah, something that's always puzzled me, and I'm not talking about Israel here, but it's said so eloquently, why the movement who supports abortion, why don't they find a Jewish woman to take it all the way up the line and say this is a religious issue, it's not a legal issue, and you're forbidding me my religious choice to have an abortion. I'm just really surprised that no one's ever done that. Any thought about that, Rabbi?
So now you're getting into the legal realm, right?
Well, we're talking legal realm right here in Israel, so it's
no, right. But you're dealing with the question of Roe v. Wade is whether abortion or a woman's right to choose or control of her body is a constitutional right. There's no question that every state can create its own laws, and someone could say, I'm not sure that, it's a very good question. I'm not sure that I have an answer on how far you could push individual choice, and from a religious perspective, in creating a policy. I would imagine that once it came to the states, it's much more difficult on a constitutional level, and I'm not a lawyer, but I would imagine that when it came to a state level, if that's what ends up having to be done, right, or even on a legislative level, right, violating religious principles for Congress to make that decision, they could do that. I don't think the Supreme Court could necessarily, and wouldn't go that way anyway. So it's a moot point.
No, I agree with you. It would be a state.
It would be either a state by state, or it would be a legislative, which isn't going to be happening.
Right. But even if it was a state, even if a woman came to the state that forbid abortion for any reason, and a woman's life was in jeopardy, either mentally or physically, and she said, you're denying me my religious right, it would go to the Supreme Court ultimately, because the state would either approve it or turn it over, and somebody else would fight it. But then it wouldn't be based upon Roe v. Wade. It would be based upon whether someone has the religion, whether it's interfering with one's religious right. It just,
so all I would say is we any kind of challenge like that, which by the way has taken place a lot in recent years. Just think of the arguments over, is there a religious reason not to take the vaccine? And so I want to be exempt religiously from taking the vaccine, which almost no denominations, except for one Michiganer rabbi in Florida that's doing it. He's about the only one. Almost all the Orthodox rabbis say there is no exemption to that in America or Israel. And certain other aspects of denominations of certain churches, mostly evangelical. But that whole idea that you're bringing up now has only evolved to being able to do that in the last 30 or 40 years. But we already had Roe v. Wade. So if Roe v. Wade goes away, it's a good question as to whether that could be a challenge. Don't know. Any other comments?
I think this statement so clearly epitomizes or states the tension in this whole area. The fetus is obviously something very important, but no matter what you call it, if it's murder before it's born or not, it's still extremely vital and important. And so and that's the same problem I have with all of this. People should have a choice under certain circumstances, but it should be very should be defined. I think that's a very beautiful thing. I think in practice, it's probably pretty meaningless because they're just rubber stamping many of these things. But
So, I mean, just to conceptualize again, the very first text, second text that we studied was how it's a sin, it's a mortal sin to spill your seed. So it's not even just the potential life while conception has taken place, but even prior to that, the idea that a union in love and conception, that the Kodesh Baruch Hu is there, right? We always say that as part of Jewish tradition. The Kodesh Baruch Hu was there when that happened. So Israel, Israel's example is an example that says there are limits on both sides. And my first question about is abortion pro-life, or are Jews pro-life and pro-choice? My answer was correct, that I began with, which is yes. If you look at the text and you look at how it plays out in Israel, it is both pro-life and pro-choice, and somehow manages to combine the sacredness of life made in the image of God, the potentiality, with the permissiveness and understanding that there's a difference between the potential life and actual life itself. The biblical view of the status of a fetus is not one of those rules that we can literally or figuratively write in stone. Even the tradition that developed, right? Each of us and our societies and our Jewish community need to struggle about, as David you put so well, right? Where we draw the line, in a sense. When that lines that we inevitably have to draw when we're faced with situations about we never want anyone to experience or contemplate and resolve them. Potential death of a woman, terrible psychological effects, Tay-Sachs or some disease where the child will only suffer and have to go through horrible things before they die, right? I think the bottom line for me is that the true challenge when we consider matters like this of life and death is to be cautious when other people are certain, to be sensitive when other people are strident, and going back to that first text, to exercise humility when others exhibit hubris. So certainly as a community, as I began by saying, when and if Roe v. Wade becomes overturned, then it will be the social action part of the synagogue that would consider how they would like to get involved. And certainly many communities, faith communities, will be very vocal about that, as we've been before. Most of the major Jewish communities in supporting Roe v. Wade. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
thank you.
Thank
Interesting
you.
conversation.
Good night.
All right. Good
All right.
night.
Right on.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was a
Bye.
great,
Night.
great lecture.
Thanks.
Good night. Thank you.
See ya. Going to eat dinner.